First, I want to preface this by saying I'm not trying to say the PS1 or PS2 were bad systems. What games or systems are good or bad are totally subjective. I made a video about how the Switch is the most successful console of all time, and this is while acknowledging the PS2 is currently holding the all-time sales record in both hardware and software. I also pointed out in another one of my videos how Sega was the one who put pain on Nintendo the most, despite the PS1 and PS2 being two game consoles to sell over 100 million units, with Sega never coming close to this. What I want to do with this video is look beyond the numbers and examine the circumstances which led the PS1 and PS2 to having such unprecedented commercial success. The original Nintendo Entertainment System entered a market with no competition. It also entered a market which no longer existed. Home console gaming was dead to the American market. Nintendo had the task of resurrecting an industry Atari had more or less killed for the Western audience. Video games as we know them would have been relegated to Japan if not for Nintendo revitalizing gaming worldwide. By the time Sony would step in to do their own thing with their own platform, the market was firmly established by Nintendo. The PS1 would take the world by storm, followed up by the record-setting commercial success of the PS2. They boat raced Nintendo in sales and dealt a fatal blow to Sega. The PlayStation was a commercial juggernaut, or so one would think. How was Nintendo able to remain a profitable company while being outsold multiple times over for two straight console generations? First off, Sony came in with a lot of money. Unlike Nintendo and Sega, Sony was making billions of dollars a year on things which had nothing to do with video games. Sony had no experience or clout in the gaming market, but they had the money to buy people who did. They started by buying a company and converting them to their in-house development studio in order to have more launch games ready. They then began poaching many of Nintendo's closest third-party development partners like Namco, Capcom, Konami, and most significantly, Square, who already had their next mainline Final Fantasy title in development for the Nintendo 64. This meant the gaming release roadmap for the 64 was upended by essentially all their major development partners defecting. This one is on Nintendo, investing more of their resources into their in-house gaming titles than those from their third-party partners, along with the restrictions on making and porting games. Sony was able to offer a more streamlined development experience as well as much cheaper development costs with the use of compact discs instead of Nintendo's very costly and cumbersome cartridge media. The decision to go with cartridges would prove costly for Nintendo, as they actually were able to outdo the PlayStation the very early going, but were incapable of keeping up the momentum due to the lack of games caused by third-party studios' unwillingness to sign on with a platform which was difficult and costly to develop for. There was also the issue of pricing for both hardware and software. Nintendo knocked off $50 from their initially targeted debut price of $250 to compete with Sony, who had already discounted its system by $100 from $299. Sony would drop the price of the PS1 by $50 each year, to the system costing as little as $50. This was something Sony, having deep pockets, allowed them to do, in taking a loss on their hardware and recouping on software sales. There is a report by 33rdsquare.com stating the bill of materials for the PS1 was initially $100 and then $50 later on. This was the only source I could find who made this claim, but if it's indeed true, the PS1 made considerable profit, which would allow them to gamble on their next system. The PlayStation CD-ROM not only made things cheaper for developers, it made things cheaper for the consumer. PlayStation games on average were at least $10 cheaper than the games on the N64. It goes deeper than even this, however, as piracy hit the PlayStation hard. Mod chips to play burnt discs on PlayStation games made the platform even more attractive in the ability to get PlayStation games for free. This would sew up the hardcore gamer market in favor of Sony. The situation with the PS2 was pretty similar. Nintendo again chose a proprietary gaming media with the mini discs, which would again make their platform unattractive to developers. Meanwhile, the PS2 used DVD-ROMs, which held way more data, which reduced manufacturing costs, as you can put your entire game on one disc. Sony would play the price game again, as the cost of the system would be cut in half just 4 years in, and would sell for as little as $100 toward the end of its lifespan. Sega and Nintendo would attempt to keep up with pricing, but this would hurt Sega in particular, if they didn't have the money to sell at a loss. Ultimately, Sega would be forced to leave the hardware business. Microsoft came in with a bottomless wallet and have always sold their hardware at a loss, which allowed them to always price competitively. Selling hardware at a loss was not standard procedure, but rather a tactic newcomers used to get a foothold in the market. Valve doesn't have the deep pockets of Sony or Microsoft, but they too have sold their Steam Deck below margin, though they only ship to certain markets. One can't talk about the PS2 without mentioning its most important feature, the DVD player. DVDs were a new technology at the time and were well sought after. They were also very expensive. It can't be understated how huge of a selling point DVD playback was for the PS2. Many people bought one simply because it was a gaming system with a whole DVD player thrown in for free. There was nothing Nintendo could have done to beat a free DVD player with every console purchase in the year 2000 other than to offer one themselves. We also need to understand when getting into selling hundreds of millions of consoles, you're dealing with the casual and non-gamer audience. The Game Boy, which sold some 118 million units, had studies saying nearly half the people who bought a Game Boy were women. Makes sense as the redesigns were colorful, stylish, and even more portable than before. The Wii was bought by people who didn't play games at all prior to that system. These are the people you're selling to, and they buy these systems for reasons other than being gamers. A DVD player is perfect for a parent looking to buy something for their kid, because the kids will have a gaming system to play, and the parents get a DVD player to watch their DVD movies. Even with all this, you still have to have compelling games people want to play. Sony had plenty between their first two systems. Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, Grand Theft Auto, Final Fantasy, Tekken, Gran Turismo, Resident Evil, Devil May Cry. The list goes on. What I would argue, however, is most of these titles were a flash in the pan. Many of these games didn't sell well at all, considering their install base. On PS2, Metal Gear Solid, Tekken, Kingdom Hearts, Resident Evil, and Devil May Cry were fiercely rivaled by Super Mario Bros. Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Mario Sunshine in sales. Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, and Resident Evil, which enjoyed significant sales on the PS1, dropped off heavily on the PS2. For two consoles, which were outsold by a combined 5-1, games from these consoles held a handful of top 10 spots in sales. It's also worth noting the PS1 and PS2, despite their huge install bases, did not have one 20 million seller between them, while consoles with smaller install bases had one or even multiple 20 million and even 30 million sellers. I already mentioned pricing as well as the ability to provide better deals for studios because the money Sony came in with, but it also allowed them to advertise. This is something which killed Sega with the Dreamcast, which was in every way comparable to the PS2 in both hardware and software. Sega didn't have the money to compete in pricing, though they tried and ended up hurting themselves when they needed to meet a certain quota in sales to stay afloat. They also didn't have the money to promote their system and their games. This was a major drawback, not only because Sony was very aggressive in this area, with product placements in nightclubs and bars, but Sega had excellent sports games with the 2K series, which was in every way superior to EA sports offerings. With EA deciding to not put their games on the Dreamcast, not being able to advertise meant they could not capitalize on this IP and battle for mindshare. Piracy also plagued the PS2, with counterfeit copies of games sold on eBay being commonplace. illegitimately obtained free games were a draw to the platform. As commercially successful as Sony was with their first two consoles, and as much market share as they had during this time, it's strange how Nintendo was able to take it all back with the Wii, which was significantly underpowered compared to the PS3 and 360. It's also interesting how in the end, being a quote-unquote kid system and catering to a family-friendly audience is not only what won against the PS3 and 360, but also kept them afloat during their supposed down period. Between the PS1 and N64, 4 of the top 10 best-selling games for that generation were on the N64, with 2 of those being in the top 5, and Mario 64 being number 1. Between the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, the last place GameCube had 2 games in the top 10 for sales. Meanwhile, on the handheld side of things, you had Pokemon game series selling 46 million, 30 million, 16 million, and 12 million. You had Tetris selling 35 million, Mario Land 1 and 2 with 18 million and 11 million respectively. None of these games can be considered mature or edgy. Even when we go to the 360, PS3, and Wii, the Wii holds the majority of the top 10 spots in sales, and Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty were outsold by the Wii activity games. Even with the blunder of the Wii U, Nintendo was able to get right back on top with the Switch, which has 9 of the top 10 best-selling games between the PS4, Xbox One, PS5, and Xbox Series. Nintendo created this gaming market, and it has always been Nintendo's market to lose. The times when Sony had a 100 million seller console were when Nintendo stumbled out of the gate. When they had a competitive and competent product on the market, Nintendo didn't just win, they dominated. I mentioned in my last video why I didn't talk about the PS1 and PS2. Nintendo losing those 2 console generations had more to do with their own mistakes than what Sony brought to the table. Being stubborn about cartridges and pissing off their development studio partners, chasing the trend of being edgy and mature despite the obvious success of remaining family-oriented. It was, in fact, Sega who really hurt Nintendo, taking away their market share, but more importantly, taking away their mind share in Nintendo being the only choice for gaming, which allowed other players to come in. Nintendo's efforts to make themselves edgy and mature were to match Sega. Sony would take further advantage of the situation. Sony took sort of a kamikaze approach to competing with Nintendo. The goal wasn't so much to be the most profitable platform, but rather to take market share from Nintendo by pumping value into their system, by lowering prices to bargain levels, making things as easy for developers as possible, and making the most powerful system they could, even at the cost of profits. The PS2, despite its record-breaking sales numbers, didn't make Sony much money. They carried this on to the PS3, which was reported at one time costing Sony as much as $300 per console sold. They were able to sink Sega, a company hemorrhaging money well before releasing the Dreamcast, due to a long list of failed attempts at the home and handheld console market. Yet, they couldn't take down Nintendo, as they soldiered through it with strong software sales and a wildly successful handheld platform. Sony, as a newcomer, had to be a disruptor, slashing prices for their consoles and games, essentially giving people a free DVD player, were some of the ways Sony was disruptive. Compare this to the Switch, which is poised to take the record in hardware and software, all without a price cut, while selling all their games at full price. I'd say the PS4 was a more successful console for Sony. It was immensely profitable for Sony, and games for the platform held all top 10 spots in sales for that generation. Many may talk about how Nintendo and Microsoft wet the bed with their console releases for this generation, but the same can be said for the PS1 and PS2, with the 64 and GameCube not being supported due to the choice of software media, Sega fumbling around with poor product launches and finally bleeding out financially and giving up the ghost, and the Xbox mostly being a nothing burger newcomer. As always, context is key. People call Michael Jordan the greatest of all time, despite Bill Russell having 5 more NBA championships than he did, because context matters. People name Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan as the greatest scorers ever, over LeBron James, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Karl Malone, even though the latter have several thousand more total points than the former, because context matters. Understanding the context of events helps one to realize a milestone doesn't hold the same weight in all situations.